Good afternoon, Mr. Briggs. Can you start by stating your full name and spelling your last name for the record?
Gerald Briggs, B-R-I-G-G-S.
And Mr. Briggs, were you in the room this morning when I went through the penalties for perjury?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you understand what perjury is?
Yes, ma'am.
And being advised of the potential penalties for perjury, do you promise to tell the truth in this case today?
I do.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Bakke.
And Your Honor, this morning earlier, I believe I may have neglected to offer our exhibits, so I'd like to do that at this time, exhibits 159 through 178.
And I don't know who to ask. No objection on behalf of Summit? All right. Mr. Leibel, any objection? And Mr. Pelham?
No objection.
All right. Then exhibits W-159 through W-178 are received.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Briggs, could you pull the microphone just a little bit closer to you? You're a little bit soft-spoken so everyone can hear and so this can be recorded.
Better?
I think so. Could you...
I'll let you know if you're not loud enough.
Thank you.
Could you tell the commissioners what your occupation is?
One of my occupations is the Warren County Fire EMS Chief and 911 Chief now.
Can you repeat what county it was?
Warren, W-A-R-R-E-N.
Okay, thank you.
Mississippi.
Okay, and that is in Mississippi?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and where do you live?
In Vicksburg, Mississippi, in the same county.
And for those of us who are geographically challenged, can you tell us what part of Mississippi that's in?
We are west central Mississippi, halfway down the state, all the way against the river.
And the river being which river?
The Mississippi River, I'm sorry.
And do you have personal knowledge of a CO2 leak that occurred in Satarsha, Mississippi on February 22nd, 2020?
Yes, sir.
And are you appearing before the North Dakota Public Service Commission pursuant to your request that we present your testimony to the PSC to consider in relation to what happened at the CO2 leak in Satarsha, Mississippi?
Yes, sir.
So, Chief, you mentioned that you are the fire EMS coordinator in Mississippi, in Warren County. What are your job duties and responsibilities in that regard?
So my biggest job duty is fire protection for the county of Warren and maintaining fire protection equipment and training.
And how long have you been employed in that position as the fire and EMS chief in Warren County?
Employed by the county since July of 2012.
And have you received training in regards to serving as a fire EMS chief?
Yes, I started my fire career in 1996 and numerous trainings since then through the Mississippi State Fire Academy.
Okay. And we have marked as Exhibit 172, and I believe you have your binder open to that page. Is that a copy of your resume in regards to your background and training in fire EMS?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I notice you are, in fact, the training coordinator for Warren County for medical responders.
Yes, sir.
And have held that position since 2008.
Yes, sir.
And then also there's a long list of Mississippi State Fire Academy training courses you've attended.
Yes, sir.
You've attended the National Fire Academy.
Yes, sir.
Is that kind of the premier fire academy that some firefighters are allowed to attend?
Yes, sir.
And then you've also got training by FEMA on many different topics. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And then your emergency medical training is outlined there, including being an EMT, being on the American College of Surgeons ACS Committee on Trauma, an EMT first responder, and so on.
Yes, sir.
You've also had law enforcement training.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and you have a lengthy work history going back to the 1990s in fire and EMS, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. and also have a degree in criminology
Yes, sir.
and education, additional education in emergency medical technician.
That's correct.
To your knowledge, is there any specific training in relation to responding to a CO2 leak on a pipeline that's offered for emergency responders or firemen or EMS people?
To my knowledge, specifically for CO2, no.
You were involved in responding to the CO2 leak in Satartia, Mississippi on February 22nd, 2020?
Yes, sir.
And we'll discuss that in greater detail. However, let me ask you first of all, what type of equipment is necessary to respond to a CO2 leak? What do you need?
The biggest thing that we needed was self-contained breathing apparatus.
And do you refer to that as a SCBA?
Yes, sir. Or air pack is another term.
And the SCBA in Warren County, Mississippi, at the time of this CO2 leak, how many of those SCBAs did the county have?
We roughly have 100.
Okay. And was there a large cost associated with obtaining those?
And they average between $5,000 and $6,000 apiece.
Okay. So each SCBA costs the county, or whatever the emergency response entity is, between $6,000 and $7,000 roughly.
Yeah, including spare bottles and spare masks. Yes, that's fair.
And so for 100 of those, do you recall, did you have to take out a loan there, or how did you pay for it?
We did. We had to take out a loan for it.
Okay. And do you recall how much that was for the SCBAs?
Total cost was roughly $750,000.
And just for familiarity purposes, is an SCBA something that people might be familiar with as a self-contained breathing apparatus that firefighters use when they run into a smoky building or a building on fire?
Yes, that's what's commonly on our back for our breathing.
Okay. And is Exhibit 161 an example of an SCBA, but apparently a cheaper one or than you're able to secure or were able to secure in Warren County?
Yes, that's not the brand that we have, but yes, that's an older brand.
So let's turn to the topic of natural gas. You have natural gas in your part of Mississippi?
Yes, sir.
Do you have training in responding to what needs to be done in event of a natural gas leak?
Yes, sir.
And in terms of this February 22nd, 2020 leak of CO2 from a pipeline, and that was the Denbury pipeline?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Am I correct in understanding that pipeline ran about 77 miles?
That's what I understand, yes.
Okay. And only had the one feed-in point. There was no additional plants feeding in like the Summit pipeline, where there's now 33 plants that plan to feed into that.
I have no idea. I don't think so.
Okay. And then the Denbury pipeline, do you know where that ends up at and where it begins?
I do not. I do know it crosses my county and crosses the Mississippi River to Lake Providence, Louisiana.
Okay. And is it your understanding that the Denbury pipeline that leaked was a 24-inch pipeline?
Yes.
Prior to this CO2 leak, had you been provided any training by Denbury about the pipeline and what to do from an emergency medical or firefighting or rescue perspective before the leak occurred?
Provided by Denbury, no. I didn't know Denbury existed.
Okay. Did Denbury provide the county, specifically your organization, with any of this these SCBAs or other equipment in order to allow you to respond to a CO2 leak?
No, sir.
Are you familiar with what a plume study is?
Study, no, sir, but model, yes.
Okay. And what's a plume model?
It's what we used the night of the explosion from the Weather Service to track where the gas may be headed to.
Okay. So that tells you in the event there is a leak, where
Potential victims.
where the CO2 would go, what direction it would go, where it might travel to.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And are you aware in this case that Summit has refused to provide the public or us as the attorney for the interveners with a copy of their plume model?
No, sir.
Okay. Do you feel it's important for the public to know and be able to see what would happen based on a plume model in the event there was a leak in a CO2 pipeline?
I think it's important, but I think it's also going to be hard to pick a location and geography and that type of stuff.
Okay.
You'd have to have several.
Okay. And in this particular case, it's 2,000 plus miles of Summit pipeline. And our understanding, although we've never been permitted to see this plume study, is that they've done one.
Objection, Your Honor. I let counsel get away with a lengthy bit of testifying to something that there's no foundation that the witness even knows. Last question, but I've got to draw the line here.
I agree. He already said he wasn't aware of Summit's plume study or modeling, so let's move on.
Yeah, and I wasn't asking him about that. I was asking him whether one plume study would be adequate for a CO2 pipeline that runs over 2,000 miles. I'm not asking specifically about the Summit plume study. So, over 2,000 miles, in your opinion?
Same objection, Your Honor. Again, he's testifying as to his view of the record. There's no indication that the witness has the familiarity with any of the details about this case.
Agreed, and I don't know that you've established he even has the expertise to offer an opinion on something like that.
Well, I can do that. So as a fire chief, in relation to dealing with a CO2 pipeline leak, and let me ask you first of all, to your understanding, are you and your other staff members from the Warren County EMS Fire the only EMS and fire entity in the entire U.S. that has actual real-world experience with a CO2 leak?
I was not aware of that.
Okay. Are you aware of anybody else who's had a leak other than in the one in Denbury and Satarsha?
No.
Okay. And you indicated that you were, during trying to deal with the CO2 leak in Satarsha, you obtained a plume study which showed the direction of travel that the plume was going after it leaked out of the Denbury pipeline.
Yeah, I didn't directly request that. That came through our emergency management, and it was texted to my phone.
And did you use that in your efforts to try to rescue people and to try to determine how to react to the CO2?
We did use that as far as searching for potential victims.
Okay. So back to my question, do you feel it would be adequate to have just one plume study for 2,000 miles plus of a proposed CO2 pipeline?
Objection, Your Honor. For starters, they're talking about two different things. The witness is very clear. He's talking about an after the incident information from the Weather Service, and for Mr. Bakke to try and turn that around and say, well, what about a plume model? We're not talking about modeling. We're talking about Weather Service providing after-the-fact information to the responders. The question is not related to the expertise that the witness has talked about at all.
You can ask him about how they use the plume modeling and study in his experience and how he responded, but I'm not going to allow you to compare it to what Summit has or hasn't done and whether or not that's sufficient. I think that's beyond the scope of what this witness can testify to.
I can move on and ask a different question. Is a plume model reliable in your experience if the conditions and the location of leak are not the same as was on the plume model?
I wouldn't know the answer to that question, and what I was after that particular night is, with the current conditions, the temperature, wind direction, where might I start searching for potential victims?
Okay, so let's talk about the events on February 22nd, 2020. Where were you at when that leak occurred?
I was in Vicksburg at a festival.
And so did you receive something on your cell phone, or how were you alerted?
No, actually, I was approached by one of our local law enforcement asking if I'd heard about the explosion in Satarsha.
Okay. And so what did you do when you heard about that?
I called my counterpart in Yazoo County, which is the county where Satarsha is, and asked what was going on.
Okay, and who was that counterpart, and what did he tell you?
His name is Jack Willingham, and he is the county emergency management director for Yazoo. And he really didn't have a lot of information. He said they had an explosion, didn't know what it was. Please help.
Okay. And so did you then proceed from Vicksburg to head towards Satarsha?
I did. I gathered a small crew of individuals to approach the leak from the south side.
And what did your crew consist of?
It was 3 additional guys, a UTV or side-by-side, our air equipment, and probably 20 spare bottles.
Of oxygen?
Of breathing air, it's not oxygen.
And a UTV, is that kind of like an ATV, but a utility?
Yeah, a utility vehicle.
Okay. And so how long did it take you to get from Vicksburg and to get organized and to be able to respond and get close to Satarsha, Mississippi?
I don't have my 911 times, but I would probably guess around 45 minutes.
And to your understanding, were you the first emergency responders that arrived in that location?
No.
Okay. Who had arrived earlier?
The local fire department had already set up a roadblock or checkpoint south of the incident.
Okay, and had any of them proceeded, to your knowledge, beyond the checkpoint?
No, they did not know what to do or where to go.
Okay. At that point, did you know what the explosion or leak was?
We knew it was either chlorine or natural gas.
Okay. And why did you think that's what it was?
That's what the emergency management director said he had in that area.
Okay. And did you later find out that was incorrect?
Yes, after we were done.
Okay. And you found out then it was what?
CO2.
After that leak occurred, while you're en route to Satarsha or while you're at the checkpoint, did you receive any communication from Denbury, who had the CO2 pipeline, that there had been a leak in their pipeline?
I did not, no.
Do you know if anyone did in terms of the emergency response people?
Not that I'm aware of. My understanding is they actually reached out to Denbury an hour into the event.
Okay. So it was an hour later before anybody from Denbury let any of the emergency responders know that there had been a leak in their CO2 pipeline?
That is my understanding.
So let's talk about what you did after that. So you're at the checkpoint, and what direction is that from Satarsha?
Probably, I would say, looking at a map, everybody would say it's north, but it's more, we were south west of the event.
Okay, and if you would look at Exhibit 177, or perhaps 178, that's some Google Earth photographs. Do you see that there?
Yes, sir.
And you've seen those before, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And there are some lines drawn on there with measurements in terms of miles and meters. Did you verify that those measurements are accurate?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, so let's start with 178, the first page. Where in relation to what's shown there was this checkpoint to the south that you arrived at?
It would be at the bottom of your page, but it is not on this map.
Okay. And was that along Highway 3?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Approximately 5 miles from the leak.
Okay. So why was the checkpoint, the southern checkpoint, set up 5 miles away from where the leak was?
So I can't speak for the responders that did that, but my understanding is the original department that was responding to the event, the 911 call of an explosion with a green gas, tried to go out the normal route, which is on 433, and their fire truck would not run. So they backed out, went a different route, and that's what put them at Highway 3 at that spot 5 miles from the leak. And they just shut the traffic down they didn't know what they had, so they didn't want anybody entering, safety first kind of thing.
Okay. And you said their fire truck shut down. In other words, it would
not run.
Okay. And why was that?
It's my understanding that it had no oxygen to run.
Okay. Was that because of the presence of the CO2?
Yes.
Okay. And is that something you observed on that day involving multiple vehicles as you were involved in your evacuation and rescue efforts of citizens, that there were many vehicles that had just stopped alongside the road, on the road, other locations?
Yeah, most of them are stopped where they were at. They were in the middle of the highway or in the middle of the road. Okay. The headlights still on, doors wide open, unoccupied.
Okay. And is that your understanding of what happens if there's a CO2 leak? Gas-powered vehicles of any type cannot run?
Yeah, it's my understanding that CO2 displaces oxygen.
Okay. And so tell us what you did next once you were at the checkpoint.
We arrived at the checkpoint. Again, I asked what type of leak were we dealing with, so we would know what to take in with us or how we needed to respond to it. And at that point, they still did not know. So we just loaded up everything we had for, bunker gear, turnout gear, air packs, spare bottles, whatever we needed into that side-by-side or UTV and proceeded towards the sound of what the leak was.
And you said that the sound of where the leak was, could you hear it?
You could hear it.
Was that from the checkpoint 5 miles away?
Yes.
Okay. What did it sound like 5 miles away?
It was just a light sound off in the distance, but you could tell it was something. It wasn't very loud.
Okay. And at various points that day, did you get closer to the leak location?
I did.
Okay. Did the sound change as you got closer to the leak?
I did. It sounded like a ruptured pipeline or a jet crashed into the earth and was still going.
Okay. Was it loud?
Very loud, deafening.
Okay, so using the map of 178, from that location just off the first page, the first photograph on Highway 3 to the south, where did you proceed from there?
So there was no residences. There was just farmland in between our checkpoint and Highway 433, where the town of Satarsha is. So we proceeded there. And our instruction from our command was to check the town of Satarsha for victims.
Okay. And so in that route that we see on the photograph on Highway 3, would then you have proceeded kind of northeast and then taken a left or gone to the somewhat northwest towards the village of Satarsha?
Yes, we took a left on 433, or Satarsha Road at that point is what 433 turns into.
And at that time, on February 22nd, 2020, roughly how many residents were there of Satarsha, Mississippi?
I'm not sure the actual census count, but I would guess somewhere around 60, 65, just judging by structures.
In the PHMSA report, they report that there were 50 residents in the village of Satarsha. Do you know if that's accurate?
It sounds pretty close.
And then you mentioned the SCBA and the extra oxygen tank. Tell the commissioners about that. How long do those tanks of the special oxygen last when you're using them?
It's kind of a moving target. They say 30-minute bottles, but, depending on your workload and your physical condition, and they may last 10 or 15 minutes. It all depends on what you're doing at the time. If I was wearing one today in this room, I could probably wear it for an hour. If I go out and start doing jumping jacks, I might wear them for 5 minutes.
Okay, so does it depend on the circumstances involved, whether you're physically exerting yourself,
Yes,
whether
sir.
you're under stress, whether you're anxious, those types of things? So you might.
And it just goes on your breathing rate.
Okay. And so how often that day, roughly, did you have to change or replace those oxygen tanks?
When we first started, not very often, but obviously after we walked the entire village of Satarsha, it was probably every 10 minutes.
And how many of those extra bottles of oxygen did you bring with you?
Roughly 20, I believe, is what they brought.
Were those on the UTV?
Yes.
And so what personal protective equipment, in addition to the SCBA, were you and your other members of the EMS wearing that day as you responded to this CO2 leak?
We were wearing full structural firefighting gear from head to toe. Helmet, hoods, mask, coats, pants, boots.
Okay. And that SCBA, does that cover your entire face as shown on the exhibit that we marked, Exhibit 161?
It does.
It's essentially what people might think of as a gas mask.
Yeah, you could relate it to that.
Okay. And so when you have that SCBA on and your other equipment on, approximately how much gear are you wearing? What does it weigh?
I would say probably 60, 75 pounds total.
And then if we look on the first page of Exhibit 128, it shows a distance between the leak point, and is the leak point on the lower right of that photograph?
You said 128?
178.
178, yes, sir.
Okay. And that's where it's got a label, site of CO2 pipeline rupture.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And in looking at the Google Earth map, it looks like there's no residences anywhere nearby, no structures that might be occupied. Is that correct?
In relation to the rupture?
Yes.
If you look I guess it would be more northeast, that would be where Perry Creek Circle is, and the actual resident is not shown on that map. But there is a residence pretty close.
Okay. And when you say pretty close, how far away are we talking?
It would probably be a mile, I guess, through the woods.
Okay. And then it shows a distance into Satarsha from the CO2 leak location of 1.24 miles, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So tell us what you observed as you're driving on Highway 3 and then you turn left on 433 or Satarsha Road, in terms of what you observed in terms of any victims or individuals who were affected by CO2.
Well, my first observation of victims was at the checkpoint that other people had brought from the town of Satarsha or nearby the town of Satarsha, and they were laying on the ground waiting on an ambulance.
Okay. And do you recall how many people there were at the checkpoint to the south, about 5 miles away from the leak location?
Victims,
Victims.
3 or 4. I was trying to get geared up to go search.
Okay.
But I did notice several people laying on the ground, shortness of breath and vomiting.
Okay. And did you understand those symptoms to be an effect from the CO2 exposure?
I figured it was a symptoms of whatever gas it was.
Which at the time you didn't know?
I did not know.
Okay, and so then, as you're then proceeding from the checkpoint towards the town of Satarsha, what did you observe in regards to additional victims?
Additional victims in the town of Satarsha, I didn't observe any. The one thing that I noticed as we got close to town was all the vehicles sitting in the roadways.
Okay.
But that we did not encounter any victims in the village of Satarsha.
Had there been others that arrived there before you who were involved in rescue efforts for the individuals?
There was a deputy checking houses also as we were walking through. We ran across him we had to make him leave by ambulance to go get medical care at a hospital.
Do you recall that individual's name?
I think he may be an investigator. I don't want to speak for that. His name is Terry Gant, G-A-N-T.
And then in terms of these vehicles where you saw the doors open and they're stalled on the road, had there been, to your understanding, occupants in those vehicles before you arrived that had by then been evacuated out of the area?
Yeah, and I would just assume that was the people that were at the checkpoint.
Okay, and then in Satarsha, did you learn from other EMS, not necessarily by talking to them there, but at some point that day, that there had been individuals in Satarsha who had symptoms as a result of exposure to the CO2?
Yes, my understanding is there were several people at their houses outside having a barbecue, and one of the ladies come outside to find them all collapsed on the ground.
Okay. Unconscious?
I don't have that answer.
Okay, and so where did you proceed next after observing the abandoned vehicles along Satarsha Road and going into Satarsha?
We checked the village or the town of Satarsha all the way to the Yazoo River, which is on that map. That was the populated area according to the Weather Service plume model that we needed to check. We were coming back out, and command asked us to check one more place. It was a road across Highway 3 on 433. It was Perry Creek Circle, which was really close to the leak. That road is.
Okay. And so on this photograph we have Exhibit 178, where would that be? Would that be to the right-hand side of Highway 3 where we see 433 curve somewhat to the south?
If you'll look just to the right of Highway 3 at Satarsha, there's actually a label that says 433.
Okay.
That's the road to the left of that label. That's Perry Creek Circle.
Okay, and so how far did you proceed down that road?
If you look at the map, it looks like some sort of creek that's there right after the first turn in the road.
Okay.
Just on the other side of that creek.
Okay. So just so we're clear here, where the words United States Postal Service appears, it would be to the right of that, just a little bit below the 433 sign we see on here?
It would be above and to the right of the 433.
Okay.
That's Perry Creek Circle.
Okay. And so what, if anything, did you observe in terms of victims on Perry Creek Road?
We encountered a small sedan in the middle of the road, headlights on, doors closed, with 3 victims inside of it.
And were you on the UTV at the time?
Yes.
Was that able to operate or run?
It was, the whole night had been trying to die. We actually related it to, I'd made a comment, we need to get the fuel filter changed. but it was still running, just not very well. And the closer we got on Perry Creek, it did not want to run.
Okay.
So actually, when we found the victims, we bailed off and told our driver to go somewhere and make sure it stays running. And we would either drag these people out or call him back.
And so this small vehicle, you approached that, and what did you observe?
So I looked in the rear right passenger window and observed a male slumped over the rear seat, did not appear to be breathing and was foaming out of the mouth. And then the front seat was the same. 2 individuals appeared not to be breathing with frothy stuff coming out of their nose and their mouth, and the vehicle was still in drive and the radio was on.
Did those individuals appear to be unconscious?
They were absolutely unconscious.
Is it your understanding that those 3 occupants of that vehicle were experiencing symptoms of exposure to CO2?
And still at that time, I had no idea what they were exposed to.
But do you know since?
Oh, now I do know. Yes, sir.
Okay, and so what did you do in response to seeing these 3 occupants? And first of all, were they unconscious?
They were unconscious, unresponsive.
Okay. So what did you do when you see these 3 unconscious individuals inside the vehicle foaming at the nose and the mouth?
Well, like I said, it did not appear that they were even alive. So our first instance was to break the glass to gain access to the victims to verify that they were alive, and they were. They were breathing 6 to 8 times a minute and shallow.
Okay. So what does that tell you, if anything, if a victim is breathing 6 to 8 times a minute?
If you were breathing 6 times a minute, I would be bagging you to make you breathe.
So did you consider this a life or death situation
Absolutely.
for these individuals?
We needed to get them to care.
Okay. Did you think there was a chance that they were going to die due to the CO2 exposure?
I did, and like I said, I didn't know the reason why they were the way they were, but I actually made the comment that I didn't expect them to live through the night.
Okay. And you said you had to break the window to gain access to these victims. Were their windows closed at the time?
All of their windows were closed and doors were locked, just as you would drive in your car. Your windows are up and your doors locked.
And did you determine at any point during this process whether the vehicle for these victims was in drive or park or neutral?
It was in drive. We secured the vehicle, as we do with any type of motor vehicle wreck.
But the vehicle was stationary?
Yes, it was sitting still. The driver had his foot on the brake.
And so did you believe it was in drive but not moving because the engine couldn't run?
The engine couldn't run and it was on a flat surface.
Did you feel it was necessary to immediately try to get those victims to a location where they could receive medical treatment and potentially be in a location where there'd be sufficient oxygen for them to breathe without an SCBA?
Yes, and that was our first communication back to that checkpoint, was to make sure there was ambulances available, that we were coming out with 3 critical patients.
Did you do anything to see if you could revive them at the scene?
Revive, no, but part of your checking for an unresponsive is trying to figure out what they're unresponsive to, whether they're just alert or verbally they'll understand you're saying something, or painful, or that kind of thing. So we did the sternum rub, just the knuckles in the chest to try to get some response out of them, and we didn't get anything.
Okay. And is the sternum rub used by EMS people to see whether they respond, because it would typically be painful if you were conscious or aware?
Yeah, if you were semi-conscious, you would make some groan or some noise once somebody rubs in on your sternum.
Okay. And they made no movement? Or
There was nothing.
Okay. So you had the UTV, you had your scuba bottles on there. How did you get these? Was there any discussion about how do we take them out? One at a time, all together?
We did, and one of my guys actually asked if we were going to take them one at a time because we didn't have room. The two of us had to ride on the rear. The driver had to have his pack in the seat beside him so he could breathe also. And then we had all of our equipment piled in the back as well. So we talked about taking one, and our consensus was if we left the other two, they wouldn't be alive when we got back. So we just kind of piled them all on top of each other, and one of our guys actually got up there with them to hold them in the back, and I hung on the side, and we came out.
Okay. And so where did you take these victims? How far away before they were at a location where there was sufficient oxygen without an SCBA for them to potentially breathe?
I don't know where that point would be, but we took them back to the checkpoint 5 miles away.
Okay.
Because we didn't come off of our air, so I couldn't tell you where that line was.
Okay. And did these individuals survive?
Yes, they did.
Okay. And do you know if they were hospitalized, and if so, for how long?
It's my understanding they were hospitalized, but I do not have a link that they were in the hospital.
Out of the PHMSA report indicates that out of the 50 residents in Satartia, that 45 out of 50 were treated or had to go to the hospital or were perhaps hospitalized. Is that your understanding as well?
I do understand it's 45 total patients, but out of Satartia, I'm not sure because there was some people just traveling down the highway that did not live in Satartia that ended up being hospitalized as well.
Okay. What was the wind direction that day?
It was to the north and kind of to the northeast.
So it was blowing from south and going to the north and northeast.
Geography-wise, it was blowing out of the hills, the hills of Vicksburg Hills, before the delta of Mississippi, and blowing down into the river bottom.
And so could you actually see a plume or see anything visual that would tell you which direction that plume was going or which way the CO2 was?
We had 911 reports that there was a plume or a gas or a fog or a green gas. I never witnessed anything.
Okay. And based on the modeling, and you got that from the Weather Service, is
Yes,
that correct?
I got it from our command. They got it from Weather Service.
Okay. And so that showed that this plume went to the north, and was it northwest or northeast?
Northeast direction.
So after you dropped off these 3 victims, and incidentally, have you had further contact with at least one of these victims in terms of their, whether they've had any long-term effects from this CO2 leak exposure?
I have talked to one of them. I've actually got to meet one of the guys that we pulled out of the car probably a year after the event, and then I also talked to him again this year. We exchanged numbers, and I ironically talked to him on Super Bowl Sunday of this year because he wanted to know who I was pulling for.
And did he offer anything in terms of his medical condition and what, if any, ongoing effects he had from the CO2 exposure?
I didn't ask him directly if he was still having effects of. I just, asked the general question that we asked to be nice, how you been doing. He offered up that he was still having some problems due to it. And I asked what type of problems. He said he was still having severe headaches and nausea and couldn't sleep at night.
Okay, so after you drop off these 3 victims that were foaming at the mouth and nose, unconscious, where do you go after that?
We looked back at the plume model, and we had some better mapping at that point, and we continued on out. I guess it would be northwest, northeast, whichever direction it was of the plume, and we noticed there were some houses out that way as well, going towards the next town, so we went and searched those houses as well.
Okay. And then if we look at the second photo with the distance on it, part of Exhibit 178, there's a line from the pipeline rupture or leak location, and then it has an endpoint on that Satarsha Road. What's that endpoint on the upper left-hand side?
The endpoint looks like it's in the middle of a field, but that's 3.5 miles from the blast site. But if you also look before the endpoint, there's a few scattered structures in there, and that was some residences. That was the last residence on that road.
Okay, so where I see the word Satarsha Road, the second one from the left, it appears just to the left of that there's some type of buildings or structures. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. There's a couple houses and several mobile homes in that area.
Okay. And so did you proceed there to see if there were any victims from the CO2 in that location?
We did. We went there, again, on our side-by-side, and the conditions for it running were better out there for the side-by-side to run. And we did find several people that were experiencing some shortness of breath, but no major symptoms, but wanted to go to the hospital to be seen.
Okay. And so would that location where those victims were be something in excess of 3 miles from where the leak location was?
It's roughly 3 miles.
Okay. And so during that between that distance of the leak location to that roughly 3 mile location, in that area, was that all area where, in order to breathe and not have effects from the CO2, an individual would have needed to wear an SCBA?
I could only assume because we were wearing ours. I couldn't tell you that, other than the victims we did find were experiencing shortness of breath.
Okay. And those were 3 miles away?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And the individuals in Satarsha, you understand, had been evacuated and rescued by others?
Yes. They supposedly, we had 2 checkpoints, one north of the event and one south. So they went in both directions.
Okay. And the one to the north, was that further to the north on Highway 3?
Yes, sir. It's not in the map.
And then if we look at the third photograph on Exhibit 178, we can see there that there are farmers' fields. It goes out 2.49 miles. But other than the structures you talked about on the prior photograph, it does not appear there's any residences or occupied structures at all. Is that correct?
And there's not. The next closest thing, probably 5 miles out, would be fish camps that weren't occupied in February.
Okay. And so if we turn to the fourth page of Exhibit 178, is that zoom us further out from Satarsha? So now we're a distance of 6.21 miles away from the leak location?
Yes.
Okay. And is that the direction that the plume went that day of CO2?
That's the direction that the Weather Service said the plume would go.
Okay. But you can't at that point visibly see it?
No, I never seen a plume or a gas or anything like that.
Yeah. And then on that fourth page of Exhibit 178 that shows 6.21 miles from the leak location, as we follow the plume there, doesn't appear there's any residence or occupied structure at that time, at least on the date of this CO2 leak. Is that correct?
There are some on Highway 16 and Highway 14, but they're farmhouses, very scattered.
Okay. Do those show up on this photograph?
I don't see any.
Okay. And then the next page, the last page of Exhibit 178, shows a national forest and a national wildlife refuge, actually 2 national wildlife refuges, Theodore Roosevelt and Panther Swamp, and the Delta National Forest. Is that pretty much, as you get further away, completely unoccupied and it's national wildlife and national forest land?
Yeah, the biggest occupancy you have there are some deer camps. It's very scattered.
Okay. And those deer camps, would I be correct in understanding on February 22nd, 2020, they wouldn't be in use?
Hopefully not, because deer season would have been closed on January 31st.
And so what effect did it have, to your understanding, that the location where this CO2 leak occurred and traveled with a plume of roughly 25 miles have on the number of victims, that it was essentially very rural, much of the area completely unoccupied?
I think, fortunately, that it was very scattered rural communities. I couldn't imagine this type of severity of an incident happening somewhere closely populated. I think they were fortunate that it happened on a Friday night at 7 o'clock. So most people were gone to the nearest town to eat or go out or whatever it was, and not everybody being at home.
And in Satarsha, at that time at least, were there any restaurants where you could go on a Friday night or places to go?
Only the grill in your yard would be your restaurant.
Now, let's talk about the actual leak itself. And you indicated that you could hear the noise, and as you got closer to the leak, it was a very loud noise?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And there is a timeline. If you turn to Exhibit 155 in your binder, and incidentally, when you get there, we'll talk first about page 12 of 21.
Okay.
And page 12 of 21 shows the direction of the plume from Satarsha.
Yes, sir, from the Weather Service.
And is that your understanding of the direction of travel of the plume from this CO2 leak event on February 22nd, 2020?
Yes, sir. That's not the map that I received by text, but general direction, yes.
Okay. And it indicates that the plume went 40 kilometers, and I should know this stuff. I'm married to a Canadian, but I'm not very good at it. But we've done the math. 40 kilometers equals about 25 miles. Does that sound correct?
If you say so. I don't know that math either, sir.
Okay. But a person could do the calculation.
Absolutely. I think it's actually 24.8 miles.
24.85 miles the plume went.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Okay, so then let's talk about this this timeline that is provided in the PHMSA report. And incidentally, Exhibit 155, you've seen that before. It's the PHMSA report regarding this
Yes, sir. I have.
Satarsha, Mississippi CO2 leak event on February 22nd, 2020 on the Denbury pipeline.
Yes, sir.
So let's turn then to the page that has the timeline on it.
Page 6.
Okay. Thank you. So this timeline indicates that the Denbury pipeline ruptured at 7:06 p.m. and it says at 7:14 p.m., so 8 minutes later, that Denbury's control room remotely closed 3 MLBVS. What's an MLBVS?
I have no idea.
Is it some type of shutdown valve, to your understanding?
Objection, Your Honor. The witness just testified he has no idea.
Yep, that's what he said.
Okay. So it says 1 MLBV at Tinsley Station, which is upstream of...
Objection, Your Honor. Now he's just going to testify on his own to put it in. That's clearly not proper.
I'm just reading from the document.
The witness said he has no idea what it's talking about.
I
What's
didn't
gonna
ask
be
him
your-
a question yet.
What's going to be your question, though, if you already...
My question's going to be, does it indicate that one MLVB was shut down upstream of the rupture site and two MLBVs at Satarsha and Redwood, which are downstream of the rupture?
Well, the document speaks for itself, so I don't know that he needs to answer that.
Well, I need to lay the foundation for my next question.
But the foundation fails because the witness doesn't know what that refers to. The document's in the record already.
Correct.
Right, and I'm just going to read him to the document and then ask him some questions so I can set the stage.
But if he's not familiar with what the document means, there's no appropriateness to the follow-up questions.
I'm not asking him about the valves. I'm asking him, does it say that? And he can say yes or no, and I'll ask my next question.
That seems rather inefficient when the document's already in to ask if a document says something, but we can,
That's actually defined, Randy, page 4, fourth paragraph in MLB.
Okay, so that we can define that, as Summit has requested. Do you see the fourth paragraph down on page 4? That they define the MLBVs as the mainline block valves?
Yes.
Okay, so then let's skip back to the timeline. And it says at 7:14 p.m., eight minutes later, that these valves, what they call MLBVs, one was shut down upstream of the rupture site and two valves were shut down downstream of the rupture, correct?
That's what it says, yes.
But then this report from PHMSA indicates towards the bottom of the pipeline at 7:43, IC confirmed Denbury's CO2 pipeline had ruptured. However, no one could get close to the release site due to the ongoing release of CO2. So despite the Denbury remotely shutting off these valves, it didn't stop the leak. Is that your understanding?
I never seen the leak at that time. I
Right.
could hear the leak, but I never seen the leak.
Okay, and I'm not asking about seeing the leak. So how long did you hear the noise from that leak that night?
I don't have an exact time, but it was probably 2 to 3 hours.
And so if Denbury is telling PHMSA in this report they shut it off 8 minutes after the leak occurred by closing the remote valves, you weren't even at Satarsha at that time, correct?
No, I probably got there closer to 8 o'clock.
Okay. And after 8 o'clock, you could hear the noise from the CO2 pipeline continuing to leak for 2 to 3 hours more.
Yeah, probably closer to 10 or 10:30.
In this location on the Denbury pipeline, between the valves that have been described here, it was 9.55 miles. And in terms of the 24-inch pipeline, is it your understanding that noise you're hearing for 2 to 3 hours after you get there at 8 p.m. is CO2 that's between those two sections of the valves?
That's what I was told that night because our command kept telling me that it was closed. So I relayed back, well, they may ought to tell the leak that it's closed because I can still hear it. And they said, well, it just takes time for it to bleed out of the line, that it was off.
Was the entire village of Satarsha evacuated because of this incident?
The entire village was empty, yes.
Okay, and in this case, we've heard testimony, including today, that Summit is proposing 20 miles on the same size pipeline, 24-inch between valves. Did you hear that?
Yes, I did.
Do you understand then if there was a leak somewhere in that 20 miles, it would take longer than what happened in Satartia for that CO2 in the 20-mile pipeline to bleed out, depending on how big the rupture was and where it was?
Yeah, and I think that's a fair statement, depending on the leak.
In terms of physical symptoms by victims, you mentioned the rapid breathing, people being unconscious, foaming at the mouth and nose.
I did not mention rapid breathing. I said shallow.
Shallow breathing?
Slow
I'm sorry.
breathing.
Okay. And then you also mentioned the vomiting. Did you observe or come to the conclusion that any of the victims you encountered were confused?
The elderly people that we evacuated, I guess it would have been second on Satartia Road, were confused with shortness of breath.
There's some discussion in the PHMSA report about NCS. Do you know what NCS is?
No, sir.
Okay. Have you heard of hydrogen sulfide?
Yes.
Okay. And hydrogen sulfide, when there's just a small portion, parts per million, can cause a rotten egg smell, something like people might be familiar with from natural gas or propane.
You're referring to H2S?
H2S, I'm sorry. Right. Hydrogen sulfide.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Was there a smell that day at some point when you were involved in your rescue efforts of a rotten egg smell?
I couldn't advise. I had my breathing apparatus on. You can't smell through that.
Okay. At least you didn't smell
I
it.
did not.
Okay. And if you look at Exhibit 166 in your binder, you see that document, which comes, is a chart from OSHA information identifying the effects of H2S or hydrogen sulfide, identifies symptoms depending on the parts per million that someone is exposed to H2S. You see that there?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then if you turn to page 8 of 21 of Exhibit 155, which is the PHMSA report.
Okay.
The last paragraph down before it says, summary of return to service, and I'll just read this, the paragraph above that. According to first-hand accounts as well as second-hand accounts from first responders, there was a, quote, rotten eggs, unquote, odor associated with the CO2 release and gas plume. A rotten eggs odor can be attributed to the presence of H2S, which is naturally occurring in the geologic formation that serves as a source of the CO2 in the pipeline. And it goes on to say, PHMSA reviewed the CTEH air monitoring results and did not identify any observed readings of H2S by monitoring equipment. The monitoring equipment's detection limit for H2S was 0.1 parts per million. Do you see that there?
Yes, sir.
So does that tell you that the monitoring equipment that was used detected parts per million of H2S in the area of the leak of 0.1 parts per million?
Yes.
Okay. And if we go back to the chart, Exhibit 166, and we look on there for the parts per million of 0.1, it has a range there, and it says when someone's exposed to H2S of 0.01 to 1.5 parts per million, what will happen is there'll be an odor threshold and a rotten egg smell, correct?
That's right.
Doesn't report that you'll have any physical symptoms or problems or issues as a result of that low-level parts per million of H2S, correct?
That's right.
Okay. And then even if you go up to 10 parts per million, which would be over 10 times what was reported in the PHMSA report, you can have exposure over 8 hours without any physical symptoms, correct?
Yes, sir.
Do you agree these physical symptoms you described can't be accounted for based on any exposure of victims to H2S?
No, the symptoms that I seen with the victims that I dealt with were not typical symptoms of H2S.
Okay. And the symptoms that you observed, do you believe those were symptoms of the CO2 exposure from the Denbury pipeline?
I do.
Since the event in Satarsha, the leak event, have you been involved in different panels and been at different locations where the dangers of CO2 and a leak in a pipeline have been discussed and addressed?
Yes.
Okay. And tell the commissioners about that.
The latest one I've been to is in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They're going through a similar, I don't know the name of the pipeline, but through something very similar.
Now, I'd like to talk about lessons learned from this CO2 leak in Satarsha. Based on that Denbury leak near Satarsha that you responded to as the local fire EMS chief, did you come to any conclusion as to whether any public engagement efforts were necessary to ensure public and emergency responder awareness should be provided to first responders and the public in the event a CO2 leak might occur?
Absolutely. Most pipeline groups, we have annual meetings and trainings, and here's the equipment that you need for our type of gas or whatever they're doing. They reach out to the small rural fire departments. That's where these pipelines are going. They're not going through major cities where they have the resources and training to deal with this. They're going out in the county. Obviously, for that reason, it's less populated if something does happen. But just like I learned then in 2020, I had no idea Denbury existed, and I actually made the comment to a Denbury representative on scene that, thank God I don't have this running through my county. He asked me what my county was. I told him. He said, we run right through the middle of it. And my response was, we need to talk. That was in 2020. He came to my office 4 weeks ago.
In relation to this smell of the rotten eggs that people could smell, or some people smelled, who didn't have the SCBA on, do you think that was actually helpful in this situation with the leak in Satarsha, that there was some odor that people could smell?
I think it would be helpful to know that there is a leak, yes.
Okay. And if there is no odorant like H2S, like Summit plans no or has no odorant in the proposed ethanol to be put in this pipeline, is it your understanding that CO2 will be colorless, odorless, won't get any notice that it's occurred other than possibly the sound of a leak or an explosion, depending on how close you are to that?
Yes.
Okay. And in your opinion, is that what makes CO2 particularly dangerous to people, is you're not going to get that type of advance warning, and also because of the health problems that you've seen personally arise from exposure to CO2?
Yeah, I think it's kind of twofold, that is definitely it, but also just in talking with some local fire officials here in your state, if you're not in a big city, you have to wait on the big city to come to you. So that doesn't hold very well for the people that are trapped in their house or in their car not breathing. waiting on the city of Bismarck to come with their response team.
Did you yesterday drive through the areas to the north and east of Bismarck where the Summit is proposing this CO2 pipeline to be installed?
Yes, I drove their proposed pipeline.
And did you observe the populated areas in those locations?
Yeah, it looks like there's a lot of growth in that area. This happened recently. There's a lot of new buildings and homes there.
And did you notice that there's one or more grade schools that are located relatively close to where this proposed Summit pipeline is planned to go?
Yeah, there were several new schools, actually.
Do you feel that would be a safe location for this CO2 pipeline to go in north and east of Bismarck in these areas that you saw that have the level of population you saw if there were a CO2 leak?
My opinion is no, just because of the growth in that area.
Summit takes the position that these CO2 pipelines are no more dangerous than a natural gas pipeline or an oil pipeline. Do you agree with that?
Well, all pipelines are dangerous. I do agree with that. But the one difference is the weight of the product, that it's not going to go straight up in the atmosphere. It's going to sink. It's going to sink in your lower line areas.
And if, as an example, there's a natural gas leak and it should start on fire, is that typically a situation where you're not going to see it go over 3 miles and affect victims of the exposure?
No, most of your natural gas leaks, the reason you have the explosions is because they're trapped in some type of structure and they have ignition.
Do you believe that that CO2 pipelines pose a significant safety risk to the public?
Yes.
In your experience, how far away should these CO2 pipelines be placed in relation to populated areas?
Just in my experience of what I've seen in Yazoo County, a couple miles at least, that's where we stop seeing victims.
Okay. And then in terms of where the Summit pipeline is placed from populated area, and I'm setting aside Yazoo, such as the areas you saw in Bismarck, do you have an opinion about how far away that pipeline should be from these areas north and east of Bismarck?
No, I don't.
Okay, that's all the questions I have.
All right. Mr. Dubilinski, any questions?
I do, Your Honor. Thank you very much. I will try and work my way through this efficiently, but I do have a couple follow-ups, Chief Briggs. You were talking about some of the other interviews and panels and things that you have been on. One of those was with a group of pipeline opponents led by a woman named Jane Klebe. Is that correct?
What was the name?
Jane Klebe from Nebraska. You were on it with Jack?
Yes. Yes. I don't know the leader of that, but yes.
Yeah, but you know the one I'm talking about.
Yes, sir.
And I've watched that. I've read some other interviews with you, so I do have a little bit of background, and I appreciate the opportunity to get to talk a little bit with you in person. And we have the odd situation where my opposing counsel actually asked a lot of the questions I was going to ask, which will speed things up a bit. You were talking a fair amount about the equipment and things that you had with you when you went out to the incident that evening. Did you have gas monitors, air monitors with you?
No.
Would that be something that you normally would take into a known gas leak?
Yes, but they didn't have any in Yazoo. I didn't respond as a hazmat. Since that incident, the pipeline group has given gas monitors.
Okay. And that was going to be my question.
Yes.
In that situation, having gas monitors would be helpful, correct?
It would, yes.
And I believe you covered this, but you said that normally pipeline groups actually do meet with you and other counties to talk about the pipelines in your county, and they do that sort of outreach, correct?
Yes, annually.
In your experience, was Denbury an outlier in that regard?
They weren't there.
What's that?
They weren't there. I've never seen them.
But you have seen plenty of other pipelines.
Oh, yes, sir.
Okay. And I guess my question was, in that regard, is Denbury unusual for not doing that sort of outreach with you?
Yes.
Roughly, actually, let me back up a little bit. You said you got there about 8 o'clock and it's February. I assume it was dark out?
Yes.
I believe that you made the reference in that video that we were talking about a minute ago that the term you used was this was the perfect storm. Do you recall that?
Yes.
You're not an engineer by trade, are you?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so what you're talking about there were weather conditions, as
Yes.
I recall, correct? The wind was relatively calm.
Yep.
I think you mentioned in discussing that it was cool.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you meant by this was the perfect storm or the worst case, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I believe you said that when you went in, and you've stressed several times that you didn't know what gas you were dealing with, but I think you said that we took our standard precautions or did our standard protocols. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And so for a known gas leak, you would do essentially the same thing regardless of the product. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Is there any different way you would approach it if, for example, you knew it was chlorine?
No.
Okay. And you do have other products that can be hazardous that come through your county by pipeline, correct?
Sir.
Come through your county by rail?
Yes.
Come through your county by road?
What was the last one?
By road, by truck?
Yes. And river.
Roughly, once you got out to the car where you rescued the three folks, roughly how long were you at that location?
With them,
Yes.
I would say 10 minutes max.
Okay, so
Break
10
the
minutes
glass
to
and throw it
break
in
into the car, get them,
Get gone.
drag out. Have the pipeline companies provided some of the SCBA?
That we have? No, sir.
Do you have any way of knowing how long the folks that you carried out of that car had been in that location?
I don't. I would assume since the explosion or the leak.
And you said that, and to be fair, I don't think it was today, I think it was on the video. I believe you said that was roughly a quarter mile as the crow flies from the leak, is that correct?
Yeah, and that was just me looking at some mapping of where we were at.
You said that you ran into some folks right at the end of the night that had some shortness of breath and said they wanted to go to the hospital to be safe, was that correct?
Yes, sir.
Is it possible that some of the other 45 people that were alleged to have gone to the hospital, that was their view on it too? Feeling a little headache, I think I'm going to go to the hospital to be safe.
That'd be a fair assumption. I did not encounter those people, so.
So we don't know out of that 45 how many, if any, were admitted, if they were,
I can only
checked
tell
in
you
those.
the three.
We were talking a minute ago about standard protocol for gas leaks. Is that protocol something that you have trained on in the past?
Yes.
And your whole department would have training on standard protocol for gas?
It's a block in standard certification. And it's not just gas leak through pipeline, it's just hazmat incidents.
And to be clear, you said the three folks that you helped get to safety, that they all survived.
To my knowledge, I know one, just because I've had communication. I have not heard of any deaths related to it.
Okay. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
All right. Mr. Pelham?
Good afternoon, sir. I believe you testified that you had talked to some local fire department personnel in North Dakota.
Yes, just people I ran into.
Okay. Was that recently on your trip up to Bismarck?
While I'm here today.
Okay. So what types of things are you conveying to them about the potential for a CO2 line coming through their communities?
So my stance on this has never been for or against pipelines or anything like that. My stance is how underprepared we were as a community for the pipeline. So training, supplies, equipment, those are the things that if this thing goes in place that you need to ensure, and we often get overlooked, especially in the rural setting, that it's not a big city, they don't have the resources. So we may tell one person, this is what you need to do, but the turnover rate for volunteer fire departments is so high, they may not be there next year or the year after that. It needs to be an annual in-service. What can we do to help you help our community?
As far as the vehicles, you mentioned the UTV, the side-by-side that was used, and it was working, but there were some issues and there was some concern about it, conking out, for lack of a better word. Have you, in your experience since the incident in Sartarsha, have you come across any potential solutions to vehicles?
We actually discussed locally about golf carts or electric type vehicles. Just in case of that incident, we can drive to the scene.
I don't have any other questions for you. Thank you.
Mr. Leibel, any questions?
I do have a few. Chief, on the night that this incident on February 22nd of 2020, did you actually see or lay eyes on the leak itself?
After our mission was over, I was asked to go look at the leak site.
Was the pipe where the leak happened, was that buried down into the ground?
Visually, no. I think what had happened there is the ground left the pipe. It was on the side of a hill.
Well, what did it look like? What did you see?
It looked like a broken pipe down in the bottom of a ravine.
Okay. So, on the night when the leak was active, were you ever within 500 feet of the leak?
No.
Would you have gone within 500 feet of the leak without a mask on?
No.
What about within 1,000 feet?
No.
Was there any residences or any people within 1,000 feet of where this leak was?
I think the closest that came was the fire truck that didn't know where they were going.
Okay.
No people or houses, no.
And that fire truck, did it just driving and then it just died on the road? What happened?
The story I heard of it was they encountered the cloud or the gas or the green, whatever it was. The truck started spitting and sputtering. The passenger in the truck got sick. So they backed out of the area, retreated.
So it was that instant. They were driving and then all of a sudden it starts sputtering and the person gets sick.
Yes.
Was that person not wearing any kind of the breathing apparatus?
Typically, we don't wear that going down the road.
How close to the leak was that?
I have no idea.
Was it within 1,000 feet?
I don't know.
Okay. Did anyone at PHMSA talk to you after this leak?
No.
And we've heard a lot of talk about PHMSA regulations. Was this Denbury pipeline regulated by PHMSA?
According to the document that it was, yeah, that I read.
And so the last question I want to ask is kind of a follow-up to the question that you talked about at the end. So we have in North Dakota a lot of rural, volunteer firemen. You probably have some sitting here in the audience. What kind of things does a rural, do the rural firefighters need? Other than, you said, some annual training because the turnover's high. What about equipment?
Well, and that's just it. The gas monitoring would help because a lot don't have it. It may be different here, but back home, that wasn't a common thing that we had. Typically, our role in a pipeline incident is just to evacuate the area, wait on somebody of better, Bismarck bringing their response team in or whatever. This was a little different because we had known victims in the highway.
Okay.
So maybe some air monitoring and, like I say, just overall training of what's in the pipe and what they can expect if something catastrophic does happen.
So this loan you all had to take to buy the breathing apparatus, was that something that your little county had to undertake?
Yes, that was our individual departments. It was not a county purchase.
Okay. And did you make that purchase because of what happened in this?
No, we purchased that in 2016.
Okay.
That was just standard firefighting needs.
Okay. I don't have any other further questions.
Mr. Pranis, any questions? Commissioner Chrisman?
What was the breach like? Was it a bad valve or a bad seal, or did a backhoe do some work and completely sever it, or what was the breach like?
So the February of 2020, we had, I think, don't quote me, roughly 18 inches of rain, and our soil type just gave loose, and I think that's what caused I think it was a weld fracture, if I remember correctly, and it just severed the pipe. It really wasn't like a pinhole or a specific leak. I think the pipe was severed.
And do you know in the subsequent reports, and I think you were questioned on one of them, but I've lost track of all these numbers, exhibit numbers. Do you know what percentage of CO2 that pipeline stream is that goes near Satarsha?
I do not. I know I read it in the reports, but I don't remember what that was.
Okay. No other questions. Thank you. And thank you for your great work that day.
Yes, sir.
Commissioner Haugen-Hoffert?
Mr. Briggs, thank you for being here.
Yes, ma'am.
And for your service to your community. You mentioned in your testimony that you looked at the route northeast of Bismarck, where the pipeline would go.
Yes, sir.
Did you look
ma'am.
at any other areas regarding the pipeline route here in Linton or Emmons County?
We didn't get here till late yesterday into Bismarck, so that's where I looked first, and then we were actually talking about riding around this community after we left here.
It might be dark.
Maybe after you're done here, it may be dark.
Sorry. I think you've answered or stated a lot as far as the safety and what local responders need to mitigate risk. You need proper equipment. You need annual training. Is there anything else, equipment, vehicles, anything else that in your discussion on panels or whatever, as far as what else is needed to mitigate risk for a pipeline like this?
From our side of it, from the fire world side of it, is just what I said, the training, the equipment, because, and I think what they were alluding to, we're going to have problems in our communities, whether it's this pipeline or railroad incident or whatever, but the training and these pipeline groups, whether it's this one at Summit or whoever, being involved in each one of these communities, not the city of Bismarck or whatever, but in each one of these communities, getting out in touch with these rural, I think one of the deputies upstairs is a fire chief just south of here. I don't remember the city, he said. But that's what it's going to take, is getting out there and educate and not just doing it one time, and making sure that they have the proper equipment to respond to your community and to your citizens.
I guess I'm going to take it a step further as far as response. Besides the company in like the EMS and fire department, what other community leaders need to be involved if an incident like this occurred? I mean, was your mayor involved? Was your, did you have shelters identified? Were they set up? I mean, because you said that the community was gone, maybe out in another community.
Right.
But was there a period of time where they were not allowed back into the residence?
It was, and I think the pipeline group are doing air monitoring to allow them to come back into their community. I don't think it was that long, maybe 10 or 12 hours. And as was said, most of the community went to the hospital. So by the time all that was over with, they were back. But there was a shelter set up in Yazoo City, which is roughly 20 miles to the north of the incident. I'm not sure if anybody came to the shelter or went to a family house or that kind of thing. But the first victim we had in this was the deputy that went to see what was going on. So they need to be educated as well. Your law enforcement, they're usually going to be the first on the scene of any event.
So one can technically say the whole community needs to be educated.
And I actually made a comment dealing with that. Where is some type of notification system that goes out? I know, yes, in our world we can do reverse 911. We can do a lot of things after we know what's going on. But where can we notify? And there were several failures with the Denbury pipeline that shouldn't have happened, absolutely. But, had we known and could set off some type of warning device, the very minimum, shelter in place, stay in your house. Shut your AC off, shut your ventilation off. I don't think y'all have AC up here, but shut your heat and stuff off that's circulating air through your house, and just shelter in place. But you need to have some way of notifying these people of what's going on. Mm-hmm. And when it's safe to go outside, because your first inclination of a big boom is to go outside and see what just went boom.
Right. And that's what I was kind of getting at, is going a little deeper into the notification system. It affects potentially everyone in the community.
Right.
It did, your sheriff, the responders, everyone, there needs to be a notification.
Yes, ma'am.
Again, I want to thank you for your service to your community, and thank you for being here. I
Yes,
have no
ma'am.
further
Thank
questions.
you.
Mr. Dawson, any questions?
Mr. Briggs, it cuts off all sources of ignition. The carbon dioxide, does it knock out pilot lights and things like that in a house?
I wouldn't know. I just know it displaces oxygen. Displacement.
And if you had one thing you could change in the whole incident besides perhaps having the pipe break, what would it be? Would it be one piece of equipment or a siren, or what would it be?
Personally, for me, it would be some type of monitoring system. But for the community, I think it would be a notification system. These people move in there. The pipeline was built, I think, in 2012. And there's people that moved there renting houses that had no idea there's a pipeline in their community, that weren't there like we are here today talking about it. They bought a house and didn't know that, it's half a mile from a pipeline. So how do you notify these people that there's a problem that they don't even know exists?
No further questions.
Sir.
All right. Any redirect, Mr. Bakke?
Yes. I just want to...
Before you go, I'm also going to remind you we've got 11 witnesses yet to get through.
I'm just following up on some of the questions. I won't steer from that at all. So you were asked this question about a perfect storm for this event, but, in planning for a CO2 leak, you don't know where the leak's going to occur or what the conditions are.
No.
For planning, you got to prepare for the worst.
Correct.
And you can't always plan for the event, or maybe rarely plan for the event that actually happens.
Well, you can plan for the event and your response to an event, but you can't predict what's going to happen.
Okay. You were asked about other transportation of perhaps CO2 or other fuels, oil, gas, and aren't they transported by barge, by train, by semis? None of those are 9.55 miles long, are they? And have this quantity of CO2 in them in a train or a truck or a a barge, correct?
Not that I'm aware of, but it seems like their train's that long when I'm sitting there waiting.
And with the pipeline, that danger of a leak is always present versus a barge going by on the river one time, or perhaps every fifth day, or a truck driving through, correct?
Yes, sir.
You talked about the golf carts and the electric vehicles, and that probably could work pretty well in Mississippi, but you understand here we have very cold weather in the winter where a golf cart or an electric vehicle wouldn't work very well in the winter.
Yes, sir. I seen the snow in May.
And you were asked by Commissioner Chrisman about the leak and what it looked like. In Exhibit 155 is a photograph showing the leak on page 9 of 21. Is that correct?
I'm familiar with it, yes.
And there was actually a color copy provided to the commissioners this morning of that leak location. We can, and to the other attorneys and parties and to the judge, you can see on there that the area is frozen in the area around the leak. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I think that photo was taken by drone the next day or next afternoon.
Okay. And did you see more ice in that area earlier than when this photograph was taken?
Yes, sir. The road that is shown there, probably for at least 1,000 feet that I was walking in, it was frozen. The trees were frozen. The reason the road was closed as long as it was because it was frozen mud all over the road where the pipeline actually exploded.
And then if we turn to, and so that would be the road shown above where the leak is, where the vehicle's positioned on this photograph on page 9 of 21?
Yes, sir, on 433.
And then you were also asked by Commissioner Chrisman about what the breach looked like. Does that breach show up on page 11 of 21 of Exhibit W155?
Yes.
You mentioned in response to one of the commissioner's questions that there was a second CO2 pipeline leak by Denbury after this one on February 22nd, 2020. Is that correct?
Did I mention that today?
Yes.
No.
Okay. I thought you said there was a second leak.
No.
Was there a second leak?
Yes.
Okay. And when was the second leak of the Denbury CO2 pipeline?
It was just down the road from the initial leak, probably 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later. I'm not real sure. Again, that's not my county. I didn't respond to that one.
And then you were asked some questions about pilot lights and so on. At any point that day when you're responding and performing your rescue efforts, did you notice anything on fire anywhere?
No.
And although you may have the perception it's always cold here, we do have to use air conditioning in the summer sometimes.
Okay.
That's all I have.
All right. Mr. Dublinsky, any further questions?
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
Mr. Pelham? Mr. Leibel?
Just had one follow-up. Was there any, so within this area that this plume was and you had victims, was there any animals or any livestock that you located or saw?
That I seen, no. I did hear a few people saying that there were some dead animals near that blast site where the ice was.
Okay. And when you said, did I hear you right that the ground was frozen for 1,000 feet around this pipeline?
Roughly. It seemed like that when you're walking it. It was probably 1,000 feet. But it was just frozen mud that had blown out of the hole.
Okay. No further questions.
Any other commissioner questions? All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Briggs.
Thank you. Y'all have a good day.